Welcome everyone. I'm Clark and I'm the producer of this channel. I'm from Lehi, Utah. I started Study My Gospel to provide another resource of online gospel learning. I partner with professional gospel instructors for our various series, including Come Follow Me, Gospel Topics, and more to come. If you like the content, please subscribe. Enjoy the video.
Hi, Study My Gospel people. I'm going to talk to you today about one of the most important events in church history and some new research that has surrounded it and a few things that we know now. And that is the martyrdom of Joseph and Hyrum Smith. A lot of you have probably made the trip to Carthage Jail in Carthage, Illinois. Carthage Jail on its exterior just looks like an old house, and that's partially because that's what it was. The jail itself was the home of the jailer in Carthage. He and his family lived in the bottom floor of the house. There was an upstairs bedroom where less threatening criminals were kept. And then, if you look at the structure of the building on the back part of it, where there's no windows, right here was the actual jail cell itself where dangerous criminals were kept. This is where Joseph and Hyrum met the end of their lives on June 27, 1844. So we're celebrating the beginning of the Restoration this year. A lot of prophets and apostles have pointed us towards the sincerity of Joseph and Hyrum Smith as demonstrated by their willingness to give up their lives. So here's some of the historical context surrounding what happened in Carthage jail. First question we might ask is, why were Joseph and Hyrum taken to Carthage jail? There's a lot of factors behind this and a lot of different opinions about what went on, but here's some of the basic things that we know. There were people inside and outside of the church that wanted Joseph Smith dead. The leader of the opposition outside the church, the most obvious leader, is a man named Thomas Sharp. Thomas Sharp lived downriver in a town called Warsaw. And at the time, there was economic competition between Warsaw and Nauvoo over what was going to become the hub of commerce in the area. Thomas Sharp was actually invited to come to Nauvoo and witness a parade that the Saints threw, and he became deeply convinced that there was something un-American about what the Saints were doing. He started a newspaper specifically to harass and accuse the Saints of crimes. He doesn't like Joseph Smith, and he's one of the people that's indicted for the murder of Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith after the martyrdom takes place. In fact, he was probably in the mob, most likely. The evidence points to the fact that he's one of the people pulling the trigger. Inside the church, there's a number of people that are disaffected as well, but the ringleader appears to be William Law. William Law is a former member of the First Presidency. He serves as a counsel in the First Presidency from 1841 to 1844, and he is removed from the First Presidency in January 1844, partially because of his disagreements with Joseph Smith over the introduction of plural marriage, and Joseph Smith's teaching the doctrine of the plurality of gods. So Joseph Smith removes Law from the presidency. Law decides that for the church to survive, Joseph Smith has to die. And he starts organizing conspirators. He's the person, along with his brother Wilson Law, that's going to publish the Nauvoo Expositor, which is kind of the spark that lights the fuse that leads to Joseph Smith's death. Another thing that surrounded Joseph Smith's death wasn't just doctrinal disagreements or economic jealousy, but also Joseph Smith's campaign for president. Joseph Smith announces that he's running for president, and we don't know how seriously he took this idea. He just felt like morally, in 1844, he couldn't support any of the candidates running for president. He didn't feel like any of them would support the Saints or give them the help that he thought they needed. So he decided to run for president as kind of a way of giving the Saints an alternative that they felt like they could vote for. Now, he publishes a pamphlet on his views on the views of government. One of the things that he suggested was that the pay for members of Congress be cut. He also suggested that lands be sold in the West so that they could abolish slavery. In fact, this is a quote from his campaign broadside, which was written partially by W.W. Phelps. It says, "Petition also, you goodly inhabitants of the slave states, your legislators to abolish slavery by the year 1850 or now, and save the abolitionists from reproach, ruin, infamy, and shame. Pray Congress to pay every man a reasonable price for his slaves out of the surplus revenue arising from the sale of public lands and from the deduction of pay from the members of Congress." So he's going to sell lands in the West and take away congressional pay and use that money to free the slaves. I don't know if this plan would have worked. We're about 16 years prior to the Civil War, which erupts over slavery. But it is important to know that Joseph Smith was abolitionist, that he was running for president on the idea that we needed to end slavery. He also favored the annexation of Texas, manifest destiny, that the United States should spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and all those things. Now, in early June 1844, William and Wilson Law published a newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor. The Expositor is kind of the inciting incident that leads to Joseph Smith's death. It's not hard to find a copy of the Expositor online. The Expositor accused Joseph Smith of plural marriage, teaching plurality of gods, and a bunch of other things. And Joseph Smith meets together with the city council of Nauvoo. He's serving as the mayor of Nauvoo at this time. And they made a decision to destroy the Expositor Press for printing libel. Now, Joseph Smith then orders the town council to go down. They destroy the printing press in Nauvoo of the Nauvoo Expositor, and it's ended after one issue. This caused a huge furor because a lot of people thought Joseph Smith was trying to suppress freedom of the press. A few years ago, Dallin H. Oakes actually researched the question of if the Nauvoo City Council acted legally when they destroyed the Expositor. This is what he wrote. He said, as a young law professor pursuing original research, I was pleased to find a legal basis for this action in the Illinois law of 1844. The amendment to the United States Constitution that extended the guarantee of freedom of the press to protect against the actions of the city and state governments was not adopted until 1868, and it was not enforced as a matter of federal law until 1931. We should judge the actions of our predecessors on the basis of the laws and commandments and circumstances of their day, not ours. So today, this would be outrageous, but in Joseph Smith's day, it was actually a legal action to take and was reasonable, especially if they felt like the expositor was going to stir up trouble, which of course it does, which then leads to Joseph Smith's death. Now, those are some of the circumstances. There's a whole lot of other nuance, and there's a lot of good books written about this. In particular, a couple that I might suggest is Carthage Conspiracy, which was written by Dallin H. Oakes himself along with a partner. It goes through a lot of the legal justifications for Joseph Smith being arrested and placed in Carthage jail. It also covers the trial of the murderers of Joseph and Hyrum Smith, which happened just a few years after the martyrdom occurred. But let's actually go to Carthage jail and talk about the actual events that occur there. To center ourselves geographically, Nauvoo is at this time by far the largest and most prosperous city in Hancock County, Illinois. But it's not the county seat. Nauvoo's up here, right next to the river. Carthage is actually the county seat. And so Joseph Smith is brought to Carthage. Before he's brought to Carthage, the whole county is in an uproar, and Joseph initially decides that he's going to leave, travel west. There's some indications that he may have been planning to circle back to Cincinnati, but just leave town and hope that would diffuse the situation. Just to show you how bad things have gotten, this is something that's actually printed in the Warsaw Signal by Thomas Sharp. He said, war and extermination is inevitable. Citizens arise, one and all. Can you stand by and suffer such infernal devils to rob men of their property and rights without avenging them? We have no time for comment. Every man will make his own. Let it be made with powder and ball. So imagine in an open newspaper someone advocating the murder of someone who's been accused of a crime. That's how extreme things were in the situation leading up to Carthage jail. It makes sense that Joseph Smith, seeing passions on the rise, decides Joseph and Hyrum are the reason why all these things are happening. Let's move out of the county and see if things calm down, and then we can come back and deal with it in a reasonable way. Well, they crossed the Mississippi River, but only stayed there for a couple hours before a few citizens of Nauvoo came over and told Joseph that he was abandoning them. Some of them accused him of cowardice. Joseph Smith goes back. The account in the history of the church said that Joseph said, if my life is worth no value to my friends and it's worth nothing to me, Hyrum kind of optimistically said, Joseph, it's not as bad as that. Everything will be all right. And Joseph turned to Hyrum and kind of reluctantly said, Hyrum, they will butcher us. A few people traveled with Joseph from Nauvoo to Carthage. One of them was Dan Jones. He later on spoke about Joseph Smith's visits with him on the road to Carthage and said this. Joseph Smith turned to him and said, I love the city of Nauvoo too well to save my life at your expense. If I go not to them at Carthage, they will come and act out the horrid Missouri scenes in Nauvoo. I may prevent it. I fear not death. My work is well nigh done. Keep the faith, and I will die for Nauvoo. So there was this feeling that once Joseph arrived back in Nauvoo and everybody knew he was there, that if they came to get him from Nauvoo, if he didn't willingly go to Carthage, what had happened in Missouri a few years earlier would be reenacted again, and the saints would suffer, and Joseph Smith refused to allow that to happen. So he submits and stays in Carthage jail. for around a week. While he's there, there's a number of people that are in and out. Daniel Jones, the guy that we just quoted, is there for a little while, so Samuel Smith. But the main people that are in Carthage the entire time are Joseph Smith, Hyrum Smith, Willard Richards, and John Taylor. Joseph and Hyrum are indicted. They have to be there. Willard and John were there because they were the only apostles that were left in Nauvoo. Everybody else, including Brigham Young, had been sent on proselyting missions throughout the United States and were not present when any of this happened. John and Willard were the two apostles that were in town, and they felt very strongly that they needed to stay with Joseph Smith and make sure that he was safe, or do whatever they could to keep him safe. We have a few documents from when Joseph was in Carthage jail. This is an actual photograph of the last letter Joseph Smith wrote before his martyrdom. You can actually see the date up here, June 27th, 1844. This is Joseph's letter to Emma Smith requesting that she secure competent legal representation. At this point, Joseph may have felt that it's possible he was going to survive, if in any case he wanted to have a competent attorney to represent him. At the end, there's a poignant note that he starts writing to Emma that goes on to the other page. It reads as follows. It says, "Dear Emma, I am very much resigned to my lot, knowing that I am justified and have done the best I could. Give my love to the children and all my friends, Mr. Brower and all those who inquire after me. And as for treason, I know now that I know that I have not committed any, and they cannot prove one appearance of anything of the kind. If you have any fears, take no harm. No harm can happen to us on that score. May God bless you all. Amen." Only a few hours later, he was killed. Now, the stories you've heard about Carthage jail are mostly true. Let me just add in a few nuances here. Joseph did ask John Taylor to sing A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief. John Taylor has this wonderful high tenor voice. He sings the song all the way through, and then they hear the mob coming down the road towards the jail. As the mob approaches the jail, Joseph, anticipating this was probably going to happen, had arranged a kind of makeshift defense. This is a cutaway of Carthage jail that the church educational system produced. As the mob approaches, they're going to surround the outside of the jail and start to fire into the windows here, here, and here. Joseph, Hyrum, Willard, and John all go over to hold the door shut, knowing that it was also likely that men would come inside the jail and try to force the door open. Now, if you've ever had a chance to visit Carthage jail, these windows are pretty big for the time period and accorded a lot of room to allow bullets to come into the window. Bullets are flying around them like hailstones, according to John Taylor and Willard Richards, the two survivors of the event. And what happens next happens in fairly short order, according to Willard Richards, about 2 minutes. So all of them move over towards the door, and the four of them are holding the door shut. Only a limited number of men can make it into Carthage jail because the landing in front of the door and the stairs are pretty narrow. In fact, if you go there today, you can see the staircase is steep and it's narrow. It's not possible to get more than a few people here. So there's four people holding the door shut. They're trying to get more and more people to force the door open, and it's kind of a battle of wills that way. As most of you know, after a few moments of fighting back and forth to open the door, the mob decided to fire directly into the door. You can still see the bullet hole in the door itself. This bullet hits Hyrum Smith in the face. He's crouched holding the door shut. He collapses, falls to the ground. Joseph Smith goes after him to see what he can do. This leaves two people holding the door shut, John Taylor and Willard Richards. Just so you know, too, at the Church History Museum in Salt Lake City, the clothes that Hyrum Smith was wearing on this day are on display. They were actually kept in the Hyrum Smith family until 2015 when they were donated to the church and put on display. You can still see some of the blood stains from the attack that happened in Carthage jail on these clothes. Now, what happened over the next few moments, we might be able to examine a little bit through some of the objects that have survived from Carthage jail. And there's probably no event in church history that has more kind of objects associated with it. So, for instance, one of the things that always gets discussed is John Taylor's watch. This is John Taylor's watch. It's now currently on display at the Church History Museum. I'll show you a couple things here that maybe you should know. First of all, as it seems that they're going to force the door open, and it's not tentative to stay at the door anyway because the mob started shooting into it, John Taylor said that he ran to the window thinking that maybe he could escape from there. As he's running towards the window, he was shot in the leg. He said it caused a kind of involuntary reaction that caused him to collapse forward. Now, what John Taylor believed happened was that as he fell forward, he was about to fall out of the window itself, and that a bullet hit the watch that was in his breast pocket and forced him back into the room. Now, it's entirely possible that that is what happened, but We don't think that it is what happened right now. Part of it is the little hole that you see on the watch right here actually isn't a bullet hole. The watch itself is very, very small. And this is a gear hole. The gears from the watch were driven forward through the face and completely shattered the face of the watch. The other thing that you can see is the back of the watch, which doesn't show any signs of bullets hitting it. What we think happened was is instead of a bullet hitting the watch, John Taylor fell forward and hit into the windowsill with such force that the face of the watch was shattered. And he later on, finding the watch after the whole martyrdom happened, in fact, this happened several days after, believed that a bullet had hit the watch. It was completely reasonable. John Taylor was not lying when he told the story or said that he thought the watch saved his life. It's just through forensic analysis, we don't think this is what happened anymore, because a group of church historians did kind of a Mythbusters thing, fired a similar caliber bullet at a similar watch, and it just exploded. It wouldn't have stopped the bullet. If it did stop the bullet, that's a miracle in and of itself. But either way, John Taylor is miraculously saved. The next thing that happens becomes a little bit confusing, because John Taylor also said that before he went to jump out the window, Joseph Smith walked over calmly to the bureau drawer and pulled out a pepperbox pistol. Pepperbox pistol has 6 chambers. It's set up so that it rotates and the cap on top will fall down and cause each one to fire. This had been smuggled into Carthage jail by Cyrus Willock and given to Joseph Smith in case anything happened for his protection. In fact, there are 2 pistols in Carthage jail, this pepperbox pistol and the single shot pistol, which wasn't used. According to John Taylor, Joseph Smith walked over to the doorway and kind of fired blindly around the edge of the doorway with the pepperbox pistol. He said only about half of the chambers discharged, the other 3 misfired, which was common with a weapon like this. One of the interesting things about this is that the pepperbox pistol that's on display at the Church History Museum, the one that you see right here, it has only been on display since 2015. Prior to that, there was a larger one that was on display that they believed was the correct pepperbox pistol. There's actually 3 pistols that at different times people have claimed to be the weapon used in Carthage jail. In 2015, when they decided to refresh the Church History Museum, they took the pepperbox pistol that had been on display and took it apart and found out that the firing mechanism had been patented the year after Joseph Smith was killed. So it probably wasn't the right pistol. This one probably is. But an interesting thing about this one is it really would be easy to smuggle it into the jail. Cyrus Willock said he just put it in the pocket of his pantaloons. It's not a very big gun. It doesn't fire a very high caliber bullet, but it would make a lot of noise and smoke. And a lot of people dispute, could Joseph Smith be a martyr if he himself had died in a gunfight? When he fired around the corner, he's firing at a group of people that are cowards. They don't think that anybody in the room has any weaponry. They think that they're just there for the taking. When he shoots back at them, it causes them to pause long enough that they never actually enter into the room. And you could make the argument that he saves John Taylor and Willard Richards' lives. Anyway, to get back to the next part of the story, John Taylor, after he's hit, lies on the floor right here. He rolls over under the bed just to show how severe the bullet fire was coming into the room. John Taylor's hit 2 more times in the leg. He has a chunk of a fist size, the way he describes it, fist size chunk of flesh blown off of his hip, and he's also hit in the wrist, and he's down for the count. Willard Richards never leaves the door and actually gets stuck behind it after the mob forces it open. Joseph Smith goes to the window, and what happens next, again, is the subject of a lot of speculation and conjecture. A lot of people depict this sometimes as Joseph Smith leaping out the window or falling out the window like he's hit by bullets. You can see from here that the base of the window is fairly wide. It's unlikely that he would have just fallen out the window if he'd been hit. Some accounts from the mob that came up in Joseph and Hyrum's murder trial actually say that he got up in the window. And we don't know the exact answer to this. We probably never will until the next life when we can ask Joseph Smith. But he hovered there for a second and then was hit twice from the outside, twice from the doorway in the back, and collapsed forward and fell out of the jail. Some people have speculated that Joseph Smith, realizing Hyrum was gone, that they were after him, may have forcibly put himself in the window and exposed himself to fire so that he would fall outside of the jail, drawing them away. He's hit, he says, "Oh Lord, my God," collapses and then falls to the ground. If his plan was to draw people out of the jail, it's actually successful. Everybody that's inside the jail runs down the stairs and outside to see Joseph Smith's body. When that happens, Willard Richards is finally able to get out from behind the door. He looks over, sees the broken window, can only see a huge amount of smoke. He can't see Joseph Smith anywhere. And so he decides, give Willard Richards credit for being brave, to go downstairs and try and do something. He said on his way out, he heard a really weak voice say, "Help me," and looked over and saw blood coming out from underneath the bed, walked over, kneeled down, and saw John Taylor. He drags John Taylor into the jail cell next door in an attempt to hide him because he believes that the mob is going to come back. This is what the jail cell itself looks like today. He drags John into the jail. He tries to hide him under the mattresses that are there, and then leans down and tells him, John, you have to survive. Someone has to tell the story of what happened here this day. Then Willard Richards goes back to stand in the doorway, armed only with a hickory cane, to wait for the mob to come back and kill him. He spends about 15 of the most tense minutes of his life waiting there. They never come back. And after about 15 minutes, he finally gets up the gumption to sneak downstairs, and he finds the body of Joseph and Hyrum Smith. What happened after Joseph fell out the window is the subject of some dispute. Again, there are some testimonies given in the trial of Joseph and Hyrum Smith's murderers. None of those people are convicted, but a lot of people, some of them former members of the mob, say that Joseph is alive when he falls out the window, that he hits the windowsill, that his body was taken and propped up against the well, and then fired into several more times. There are other stories a little bit more apocryphal about a bolt of lightning and a person trying to decapitate Joseph Smith for reward. Most historians have dismissed those as somewhat dubious, even though they were brought up by several people in the murder trial who felt that Joseph and Hyrum, or that God intervened to try and preserve Joseph's body. Well, what we do have documentary is this. Willard Richards writes a letter from Carthage jail to announce that Joseph and Hyrum have passed away. He writes, Joseph and Hyrum are dead. Taylor wounded, not very bad. Taylor was wounded very, very badly, but he's trying to reassure the people in Nauvoo. He says, I am well. The citizens here are afraid of the Mormons attacking them. I promise them no. Willard Richards took John Taylor to the Hamilton House in Carthage, Illinois, where a doctor treated him for his wounds. The doctor did come to Carthage and try to initially treat him, and John Taylor has to stay there for 2 weeks, even after the martyrdom. Meanwhile, Willard takes the bodies of Joseph and Hyrum Smith, covers them up with some pine boughs to try and preserve the bodies and keep them cool because it's midsummer. He walks and he gets a wagon and rides back to Nauvoo. And when they arrive there that night, that's where the death masks are taken. These death masks are still on display in the Church History Museum. This one is Joseph Smith. This one is Hyrum Smith. You can actually see a little distortion on the side of Hyrum Smith's nose. That's where they had to plug the hole, the bullet hole, with cotton itself before they could make the death masks. These are the closest things we have to an approximate likeness of what Joseph and Hyrum looked like. They were produced within 24 hours after Joseph and Hyrum passed away. Now, reflecting on all this, we don't want to deify Joseph Smith. It is important for church members to know that he stood up for what he believed. He really was reading the Book of Mormon until the day that he died. I believe that he gave up his life to try and save the other people in Carthage jail, and that he acted as a man of integrity. There's no denial, there's no begging for mercy or anything like that. He stood up for what he believed, and he died because of it. At the same time, too, we want to be careful that we don't glorify Joseph Smith too much, because Joseph Smith might feel uncomfortable with it. At one point, Joseph Smith said, I do not think that there have been many good men on earth since the days of Adam, but there was one good man, and his name was Jesus. Many persons think a prophet must be a great deal better than anybody else. I do not want you to think that I am very righteous, for I am not. God judges men according to the use they make of the light which he gives them. More recently, in General Conference, a descendant of Hyrum Smith, M. Russell Ballard, spoke about the first vision and also about Joseph and Hyrum's martyrdom. He said this, I've often wondered why Joseph and Hyrum and their families had to suffer so much. It may be that they came to know God through their suffering in ways that they could not have happened without it. Though through it, they reflected on Gethsemane and the cross of the Savior. As Paul said, for unto you it is given in the behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but to also suffer for his sake. One of the tough things about the gospel is an acknowledgement that if we stay faithful and we do the things that the Lord's asked us to do, we may have to suffer, and we may be asked at times to suffer persecution for our witness and for our testimony of the gospel. I'm very, very grateful for Joseph and Hyrum Smith, that even in the worst of circumstances, when they were facing death, they never faltered, they never denied their testimony. They stood up for what they knew to be right and true, even if it meant giving their lives for it, which they ultimately did. I'm also grateful for their witness of Jesus Christ and their witness that Christ lives, and the assurance that they had that they would stand with him on the earth in the last days. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. If you have any questions about this, please don't hesitate to contact me or reach out and let me help you understand some of the events leading up to the martyrdom of Joseph and Hyrum Smith. That's all for now. Everybody stay safe, and I'll talk to you later.